Survive the fall. Chapter 1. The Flight. The hum of the airplane engines was steady, almost soothing. I leaned back in my seat, arms crossed, glancing over at my dad. He sat by the window, staring at the endless stretch of blue sky outside. He always preferred the window seat. Said it made him feel less cramped. "You good?" I asked. He turned to me with a small smile. "Yeah, just thinking." That was his way of saying, "I don't want to talk about it right now." I didn't press. We'd been through enough together to know when to push and when to let things be. The flight was supposed to be smooth, just another trip, nothing special. But something felt off. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just my military training kicking in, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. Then, the turbulence hit. It wasn't the usual bump in the air. The plane lurched hard. A few passengers gasped. I gripped the armrest as my stomach dropped. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Folks, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." I exchanged a glance with my dad. He had the same look I did, calm but alert. Then came the second jolt. Harder this time. People started whispering. A baby cried somewhere behind us. Flight attendants moved quickly, reassuring passengers, but I saw the tension in their faces. And then, the worst sound I've ever heard, metal groaning, twisting. A loud, snapping crack. The left wing was gone. The plane tilted violently to one side. Screams erupted. Luggage tumbled from overhead bins. Oxygen masks dropped, swinging wildly as gravity took control. My dad grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "Hold on." The world spun. My ears filled with the deafening roar of wind and engines failing. I braced myself, muscles locked. I'd survived worse. But this? This was a free fall into hell. Chapter 2. The Crash. The ground was coming fast. Too fast. People screamed, some praying, others frozen in shock. My mind went into survival mode. Assess, react, adapt. The plane was in a nosedive, spinning out of control. I reached for my dad, gripping his arm as we braced for impact. "Stay low," I yelled over the chaos. The trees rushed toward us in a blur of green and brown. Then, impact. A violent explosion of force slammed into my chest, ripping me from my seat. The sound was deafening, metal shrieking, glass shattering, bodies hitting hard surfaces. My vision blurred, pain shooting through my body as I was thrown forward. Then, darkness. I woke up to silence. My head throbbed. Something warm trickled down the side of my face. Smoke filled my lungs, making me cough as I pushed myself up. The world swayed around me. Wreckage was everywhere, flaming debris, torn seats, twisted metal. The plane had been ripped apart. The scent of burning fuel hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Dad?" My voice was hoarse. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking beneath me. "Dad." A groan, off to my left. I stumbled toward the sound, stepping over a broken seat and avoiding a small fire. And then I saw him, my dad, lying near a section of torn fuselage, blood on his forehead, but still breathing. I dropped to my knees beside him. "Dad, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, dazed but focused on me. "I'm here," he coughed, trying to sit up. "You okay?" I exhaled, nodding. "Yeah. You." He winced, touching his head. "Could be worse." We didn't have time to sit around. We needed to get away from the wreckage before something exploded. I scanned the area, trees, thick forest, no signs of other survivors. We were alone. "We need to move," I said, helping him to his feet. "Can you walk?" He nodded, though he was a little unsteady. "Yeah, let's get the hell out of here." We moved away from the wreckage, deeper into the woods. I kept my eyes and ears open, my training taking over. First priority, find shelter. Second, assess injuries. Third, figure out what the hell just happened. Neither of us spoke much as we walked. The adrenaline was still pumping, but the reality was sinking in. We'd survived. But we weren't safe. And soon, we'd realize we weren't alone. Chapter 3. The Fire in the Woods. Night was creeping in, and with it, the cold. My dad and I had managed to find a small clearing near a rock overhang that could work as shelter. We were about to start gathering wood when we saw it. A fire. Not ours. It flickered in the distance, deep in the trees. Too controlled to be from the crash. Someone else was out there. I exchanged a look with my dad. Neither of us spoke, but we didn't have to. We both knew what this could mean, either help or trouble. "Let's check it out," he said, voice low. We moved carefully, sticking to the shadows. The closer we got, the more we could hear, muffled voices, low laughter. Then we saw them. 2 men. They sat near the fire, rifles propped against a tree beside them. They didn't look like rescuers. Their clothes were dirty, their faces rough and weathered. One of them was rummaging through a bag, one that looked like it came from the wreckage. Scavengers. I tensed. My dad did too. Then, one of them spotted us. Well, the man said, standing slowly. "Looks like we got company." Chapter 4. The Threat. The 2 men stood up slowly, their eyes locking onto us like predators spotting prey. "Didn't think we'd be seeing anyone else out here," the taller one said. He had a thick beard and a scar running down his cheek. The other man was stockier, his arms crossed as he sized us up. "We're just passing through," my dad said, his voice calm but firm. The bearded man smirked. "Passing through? After a plane crash?" He gestured toward our clothes, still torn and dirty from the wreck. "Looks to me like you're survivors. That means you got supplies." My gut tightened. I knew where this was going. The stocky man stepped forward. "Tell you what," he said, tilting his head. "Hand over your gear, food, water, whatever you got, and we'll let you go." I clenched my fists. We had barely anything, but even if we did, there was no way in hell we were handing it over. My dad must have been thinking the same thing because he reached for his waistband, where his handgun was tucked. "Back off," he said, pulling it out. His voice was steady, eyes locked onto them. The 2 men froze. For a second, I thought it might work. But then the bearded man chuckled, glancing at his partner. "Look at that," he said. "Old man thinks he's got the upper hand." Then, slowly, they started backing up, toward the wreckage. I tensed. Something was off. "What are you doing?" I asked. The stocky man grinned. "Just grabbing something of our own." I didn't wait to see what it was. My instincts kicked in, and I pulled out my own gun. That's when my dad fired the first shot. Chapter 5. The First Shots. The gunshot echoed through the trees. The bearded man flinched, ducking as my dad's bullet hit a tree near his head. The 2 men shouted, scrambling for cover. Then, they screamed. A second later, they had their own gun out. My dad and I didn't hesitate, we fired first. My shot hit the stocky guy in the leg, and he dropped with a grunt. My dad's bullet struck the bearded man in the thigh, knocking him back against the wreckage. But they didn't stop. Despite their injuries, they kept moving, cursing as they reached for their weapons again. My dad and I spread out, using the trees for cover. "Stay sharp," my dad muttered, reloading. I nodded, gripping my gun tighter. These guys weren't giving up. And we weren't either. Chapter 6. Fight to Survive. The bearded man gritted his teeth, pressing a hand against his bleeding leg. His partner was still down, groaning in pain, but neither of them looked ready to quit. "You don't want to do this," my dad warned, gun steady. The bearded man laughed, though it was strained. "You don't get it, do you?" He shifted slightly, eyes darting towards something behind the wreckage. "This ain't just about you two." I didn't like the sound of that. Then I heard it, footsteps. I barely had time to react before another figure emerged from behind the wreckage. A third man, dressed in dark clothes, carrying an automatic rifle. He raised it without hesitation. "Dad." I lunged, shoving my dad just as the rifle fired. The rapid burst of bullets tore through the trees, splintering bark and kicking up dirt where we had been standing. My dad hit the ground hard, groaning in pain. Rage and instinct took over. I rolled behind cover, bringing my rifle up and firing. My bullet hit the gunman in the chest, and he staggered before collapsing. But I wasn't done. I turned my sights back on the stocky man who was crawling toward his gun. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger again. He jerked, his body going still. One down. But my dad. I scrambled over to him, heart pounding. He was clutching his side, blood seeping through his shirt. Dad, I breathed, kneeling beside him. He grimaced, but his grip on my arm was strong. I'm okay, he managed. Just a bad hit. I wasn't sure if I believed him. But I didn't have time to think about it, because the bearded man was still alive. And he was still reaching for his gun. Chapter 7. The Final Shot. Everything slowed. I could see the bearded man's hand closing around his gun. His breaths were ragged, his body weakened from blood loss, but his eyes were locked onto me with pure hatred. He wasn't giving up. Neither was I. I raised my rifle, aiming straight at him. For a second, he hesitated. Maybe he saw something in my eyes: determination, anger, the unwillingness to let him win. Then he lunged. I fired. The shot hit him square in the chest. His body jerked, then slumped against the wreckage. His fingers twitched once, then went still. Silence. I lowered my rifle, my breaths coming hard and fast. It was over. I turned back to my dad. His face was pale, but he was still conscious. I pressed down on his wound, trying to slow the bleeding. Stay with me, I told him. We're getting out of here. His grip on my arm tightened. Proud of you, he muttered, voice weak. I swallowed hard. Just hold on, Dad. I pulled out my phone. No service, but I knew one thing: I had to get help. And I knew exactly who to call. Chapter 8. The Call for Help. My hands were slick with my dad's blood as I pulled out my phone. No signal. I clenched my jaw. Of course. We were deep in the woods, nowhere near a tower. But I wasn't giving up. I stood, scanning the trees, looking for higher ground. There, I muttered. A small hill just a few yards away. It wasn't much, but it was my best shot. I'll be right back, I told my dad. Stay awake. Keep pressure on the wound. He gave a weak nod. Just hurry. I sprinted toward the hill, my boots slipping on the damp earth. Every second felt like an eternity. When I reached the top, I raised my phone again. 1 bar. It was enough. I dialed my mom. The phone rang once. Twice. Then, she picked up. Hello? Her voice was groggy, like she'd just woken up. Mom, I gasped, still catching my breath. It's me. There was a pause. What's wrong? The plane crashed, I said quickly. Dad's hurt. We need ambulances and police. Now. Another pause. Then, oh my God. I don't have time to explain, I said. Just get them out here. I'll send my location. I'm on it, she said, voice shaking. Stay with your dad. Help is coming. I hung up, set my coordinates, and bolted back down the hill. Dad was still conscious, but his breathing was shallow. I knelt beside him, checking the wound. The bleeding had slowed, but he was losing strength. They're coming, I assured him. Just hold on a little longer. He gave me a weak smile. Knew I raised you right. I gripped his hand. You're gonna be fine. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the fear gnawing at me. Would help come in time? Chapter 9. Rescue arrives. 20 minutes felt like hours. I stayed by my dad's side, keeping him awake, listening for any sounds of approaching help. Then, finally, I heard it. Distant sirens. Relief flooded through me as flashing lights cut through the trees. A convoy of emergency vehicles pulled up, paramedics and police officers jumping out. A female officer approached first. "Are you the one who called?" I nodded. "Yeah, my dad's been shot. He needs help." The paramedics rushed forward, kneeling beside my dad, checking his vitals. I stepped back, letting them work, my hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. The officer turned to me. "What happened here?" I took a breath. The plane went down. We survived. But those men, I gestured toward the bodies, they tried to kill us. She looked past me, taking in the scene, the wreckage, the blood, the dead men. Her expression hardened. "You defended yourselves," she said simply. "You did what you had to do." I nodded, not trusting my voice. As the paramedics loaded my dad onto a stretcher, he reached for my arm. "I'll be okay," he murmured. "Thanks to you." I swallowed hard. "Just get better, Dad." He squeezed my hand before they carried him away. I watched them go, feeling exhaustion settle over me. It was over. But something told me this was just the beginning. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The next few days were a blur. I rode with my dad to the hospital, staying by his side as he underwent surgery. The doctor said he'd make a full recovery, but he needed rest. Meanwhile, the police took my statement. I told them everything about the crash, the bad guys, the fight. They listened carefully, nodding as they took notes. "You're a hero," one of the officers told me. I didn't feel like one. I just did what I had to do. A few days later, my dad was stable enough to go home. We left the hospital together, bruised but alive. And that's when I found the letter in the mail. It was addressed to me. No return address. I opened it, my pulse quickening. Inside was a newspaper clipping. My name was in bold letters. "Survivor fights back. Military veteran saves father after deadly plane crash." I stared at it, my mind reeling. I hadn't asked for attention. I hadn't wanted fame. But now, the whole world knew. And nothing would ever be the same again.